all the smells that could be imagined. It was horrible. It was infinitely worse than the smell of skunk. Silence. Stillness. Birds sang in the distance, but nothing happened. Absolutely nothing. After a long time, Lockley said suddenly, "I've got an idea. It fits into that broadcast. I have to take a chance to find out. If anything happens to me, don't try to help me." He'd smelled the foul odor at least 15 minutes before and had dragged Jill back, and there had been no other sign of monsters or not monsters upon the earth. Now he crouched down and crawled among the bushes. He came to the place where he'd smelled the ghastly smell before. He smelled it again. He drew back. It became fainter, though it remained disgusting. He moved forward, stopped, moved back. He went sideways, very, very carefully, extending his hand before him. He stopped abruptly. He came back, his face angry. "We were lucky we couldn't use the car," he said when he was near Jill again. "We'd have been killed, or worse." She waited, her eyes frightened. "The thing that paralyzes men and animals," he told her, "is a projected beam of some sort. We almost ran into it. It's probably akin to radar. I thought they'd put watchers on the highways. They did better. They project this beam. When it blocks a highway, anybody who comes along that highway runs into it." His eyes become blinded by fantastic colored lights, and he hears unbearable noises and feels anguish, and they smell what we smelled just now. And he's paralyzed. Such a beam was turned on me yesterday, and I was captured. A beam like that on the highway at the lake paralyzed 3 men who were carried away, and later 2 others whose car ditched and who stayed paralyzed until the beam was turned off. "But we only smelled something horrible," protested Jill. "You did. I rushed you away. I'd smelled it before, but I went back, and I smelled it, and I crawled forward a little way and began to see flashes of light and to hear noises, and my skin tingled. I pushed my hand ahead of me, and it became paralyzed, until I pulled it back." Then he said, "Come on." "What will we do?" "We change our line of march. If we drove into it, or walked into it, we'd be paralyzed. It's a tight beam, but there's just a little scatter. Just a little. You might say it leaks at its edges. We'll try to follow alongside until it thins out to nothing, or we get to where we want to go. Unless," he added, "they have got another beam that crosses it. Then we'll be trapped." He led the way onward. They covered 4 miles of very bad going before Jill showed signs of distress and Lockley halted beside a small, rushing stream. He saw fish in the clear water and tried to improvise a way to catch them. He failed. He said gloomily, "It wouldn't do to catch fish here anyhow. A fire to cook them would show smoke by day and might be seen at night. And whatever's at the lake might send a terror beam. We'll leave here when you're rested." He examined the stream. He went up and down its bank. He disappeared around a curve of the stream. Jill waited at first uneasily, then anxiously. He came back with his hands full of bracken shoots, their ends tightly curled and their root ends fading almost to white. "I'm afraid," he observed, "that this is our supper. It'll taste a lot like raw asparagus, which tastes a lot like raw peanuts, and a one-dish meal if it won't stick to your ribs. That's the trouble with eating wild stuff. It's mostly on the order of spinach." "I'll carry them," said Jill. She actually looked at him for the first time. Until she found herself anxious because he was out of sight for a long time, she hadn't really regarded him as an individual. He'd been only a person who was helping her because Vale wasn't available. Now she assured herself that Vale would be very grateful to him for aiding her. "I'm rested now," she added. He nodded and led the way once more. He watched the sun for direction. 2 or 3 miles from their first halt, he said abruptly, I think the terror beam should be over yonder." He waved an arm. "I've got an idea about it. I'll see." "Be careful," said Jill uneasily. He nodded and swung away, moving with a peculiar tentativeness. She knew that he was testing for the smell, which was the first symptom of approach to the alien weapon. He halted half a mile from where Jill watched, resting again while she gazed after him. He moved backward and forward. He marked a place with a stone. He came well back from it and seemed to remove his wristwatch. He laid it on a boulder and stamped on it. He stamped again and again, shifting it between stampings. Then he pounded it with a small rock. He stood up and came back, trailing something which glittered golden for an instant. He halted before he reached the rock he'd placed as a marker. He did cryptic things, facing away from Jill. From time to time there was a golden glitter in the air near him. He came back. As he came, he wound something into a little coil. It was the silicon bronze mainspring of his non-magnetic watch. He held it for her to see and put it in his pocket. "I know what the terror beam is, for what good it'll do," he said bitterly. "It's a beam of radiation on the order of radar, and for that matter, X-rays and everything else. Only an aerial does pick it up, and this watch spring makes a good one. I could barely detect the smell at a certain place, but when I touched the laid-out spring, it picked up more than my body did, and it became horrible. Then I moved in to where my skin began to tingle, and I saw lights and heard noises. The spring made all the difference in the world. I even found the direction of the beam." Jill looked frightened. "It comes from Boulder Lake," he told her. "It's the terror beam, all right. You can walk into it without knowing it, and I suspect that if it were strong enough it would be a death ray, too." Jill seemed to flinch a little. "They're not using it at killing strength," said Lockley coldly. "They're softening us up, letting us find out we're frustrated and helpless, and then letting us think it over. I'll bet they intended the four of us to escape from that compost pit thing so we could tell about it. But we'll know now, if we find dead men in rows in a wiped-out town, we'll know what killed them, and when they ask us politely to become their slaves, we'll know we'll have to do it or die." Jill waited. When he seemed to have finished, she said, "If they're monsters, do you think they want to enslave us?" He hesitated, and then said with a grimace, "I've a habit, Jill, of looking forward to the future and expecting unpleasant things to happen. Maybe it's so I'll be pleasantly surprised when they don't." "Suppose," said Jill, "that they aren't monsters. What then?" "Then," said Lockley, "it's a Cold War device, to find out if the other side in the Cold War can take us over without our suspecting they're the ones doing it. Naturally, those in the ship will blow themselves up rather than be found out." "Which," said Jill steadily, "doesn't offer much hope for—" She didn't say Vale's name. She couldn't. Lockley grimaced again. "It's not certain, Jill. The evidence is on the side of the monsters. But in either case, the thing for us to do is get to the army with what I've found out. I've had a stationary beam to test, however crudely. The cordon must have been pushed back by a moving or an intermittent beam. It wouldn't be easy to experiment with one of those. Come on." She stood up. She followed when he went on. They climbed steep hillsides and went down into winding valleys. The sun began to sink in the west. The going was rough. For Lockley, accustomed to wilderness travel, it was fatiguing. For Jill, it was much worse. They came to a sere, bare hillside on which neither trees nor brushwood grew. It amounted to a natural clearing, acres in extent. Lockley swept his eyes around. There were many thick-foliaged small trees attempting to advance into the clear space. He grunted in satisfaction. "Sit down and rest," he commanded. "I'll send a message." He broke off branches from dark green